Right lads, so I see that the NATO are sending American soldiers into Russia as we speak, right? That's what they're doing. They're sending in reconnaissance gangs. By the way, keeping an eye on the weapons that they've been sending out to the Ukraine. $85 billion worth of weapons gone out to Ukraine, and they know that 40% of them weapons are gone into the hands of ISIS.
We know, for instance, that last night perhaps as many as 100 missiles were fired by the Russian forces. At least 50 to 60 of them penetrated Ukrainian air defenses and wiped out another substantial portion of the Ukrainian power grid. In fact, today a spokesman for Zelensky pointed out that unless there are serious attempts made to prepare for the winter and improve the situation in western Ukraine, they may have to evacuate whole cities where there is no power. The country is literally operating in the dark. So this doesn't bode well for Ukraine.
And remember this, people, Russia won't be running out of oil or gas or diesel or anything to keep this war going. They have enough to keep them going for 1,000 years. It's Europe, that's who will, the instigators of this war, NATO and all their puppets that want the war. They'll be running out of fuel. And wait till Russia does what it normally does, it'll wait till the winter kicks in, the ground is frozen like a rock, then they'll be able to send their tanks out over that frozen ground. And then you'll come up against an army that are ill prepared to take on the Russians, because the one thing the Russians are good at is fighting in the Great White, in the snow and the cold. They'll have to go up to the Russian border to fight, and the Russians will be fighting from home. So the Europeans will be getting it, NATO and all their proxy scumbags who want this nuclear war, they'll be dying on the field. Not the bureaucrats or the politicians, no, but your sons and daughters, but not their sons and daughters, nor them.
Ukraine at the same time, almost completely unrelated to this reality of Ukraine's descent into chaos because there is no energy. You have this strange announcement that we're suddenly sending, after 8 months of no accountability, a few hundred soldiers under a brigadier general into Ukraine with the mission of somehow or another tracking all of the equipment that's being sent. Well, we already know that large quantities of the equipment are being sold off to others around the world, including ISIS.
As I was telling you on the video there last week, if you see it, about how they're paying ISIS to go in and fight in Russia. They're fighting ISIS over here, and they're paying ISIS to go in and fight over there. So they're paying their enemy to go in and fight another enemy they're trying to make for themselves. And Russia knows what's going on now. They know that the American government are in it, not just NATO. America are in it now as well. And they're putting in reconnaissance to scope out the place to see where they can set up military bases in Russia or on the borders of Russia. And Putin knows the crack and he's not happy about it.
What is this really all about? I mean, we've been at this for 8 months. We've spent $65 billion, and now suddenly we're worried about accountability. This is beginning to look a little like an advance party for this very dangerous proposition that a multinational coalition of the willing, a force of perhaps 50, 60, 70, 80,000 Western troops, will eventually go into Western Ukraine. This was floated, as you know, a couple of weeks ago by General retired Petraeus.
Right.
And people at the time tended to dismiss it. I said, no, you've got to take this very seriously. He wouldn't say it unless others had urged him to do so. So I think this may have something to do with it. We don't know how many Americans, contractors in uniform and so forth, are already in the country anyway. But if this is what I think it is, and there's also another rumor floating around inside the Beltway, it hasn't been officially announced, but I think it may be, that we're actually talking about standing up a Russian government in exile. Now, if you're interested in coming to some sort of arrangements with Moscow,
wow.
First of all, don't put together a multinational force to intervene, because the Russians have already said if you do this, we'll destroy it effectively. So if we go in there, we're going to be at war with Russia. Perhaps the multinational force is designed to try and drag NATO as an alliance into this war that the Europeans, frankly, would otherwise not want to fight. And the second thing is, if your purpose is not regime change, as stated by President Biden, why would anyone even consider the idea of setting up a Russian government in exile? If any of this is supposed to promote peace, understanding, whatever you want to call it, let alone an agreement with Russia, I'd say none of it works. It's a disaster.
Well, you have President Putin over the past 24 hours as well coming out and saying, look, we had a framework in place in Istanbul, right? That all got thrown in the trash at the moment that the UK and the United States basically threw in and said, no, we're no peace talks. So there's really nothing on the table at this hour, even though we keep hearing from Moscow that they would like to have discussions and they're open to it. But time is running out. And so I want to dive a little deeper into this advanced party idea, because as you said on our show a few weeks ago, once the ground freezes and once Russia's able to move its tanks and start this massive military operation of 300,000, 400,000 troops, it's game over. So what is the United States preparing or NATO forces an advanced party? What exactly would that look like to you?
When we talk about an advanced party in the military, any unit, before it moves into a quote-unquote assembly area, before it goes to an area where it might fight, it sends a small number of officers and soldiers and non-commissioned officers to examine the area and look for good places to establish positions, good places to set up assembly areas. For instance, I was part of the advanced party for the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment back in 1990 before we deployed to Saudi Arabia. I went down 2 weeks early with others, and we went into the desert and scouted the area and looked for places where we could set up. Ultimately, we used them. It doesn't take very many people to do that. The other problem with this 200 or 300 man contingent under the 1 star is, why would they need a 1 star? In fact, why would they need anybody in uniform at all? Most of the time, inspectors are in civilian clothes because they're designed not to alarm and provoke either the host country or potential opponents. So it's perfectly logical to say that these people are looking for areas where they could set up, where they can establish power, where they can fuel themselves, where they can sustain themselves, live. And I don't know what else you could point to, because the notion that they are going to track in an area the size of Texas all of the equipment, at least 40% of which is being sold off and sent to other countries, is absurd. I don't see it happening.
And he said, look, he's begging them for peace, asking them, look, let's do peace talks. They won't do it because they want the industrial military complexes. The military industrial complex wants to keep making money off of weapons. So what's going to happen now is Putin, well, don't be surprised if they start pulling out the nukes, alright? Don't be surprised if they start pulling out the nukes. And that's what you'll be looking at. See the likes of this? Because like umpteen, hundreds of thousands will die. There's thousands of people being wiped out in Ukraine all the time. NATO's doing it. NATO's attacking all over the place, not just Russia. Russia wanted peace talks with Zelensky, but Joe Biden and his cronies said, no, we don't want no peace talks. We want to keep supplying you with weapons so we can go in and get rid of all our arsenal and build up another new arsenal.
So some of the reports we're hearing, and you can confirm this on your side as well, is that Kherson specifically, there's a mounting of forces in that area. More evacuation orders have been ordered on the Russian side. Where do you think this advanced party might find the most opportune place to set up? And ultimately, then, what's the end game then? Is it the United States and NATO amass tens of thousands of forces in that area and move into the 4 annexed regions, the Donbass?
No, I don't think so. I think it's more likely that they'll stay west of the Dnieper River. And one of the points that's being made is that these forces, if they go in, will stay out of artillery range. The same thing is true for these inspectors, that they will not go forward where they might come under fire by Russian forces, that is, within artillery range. The problem with the notion of outside of artillery range is it excludes the tactical and theater ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, which the Russians have thousands of, carrying up to 1,000-pound conventional warheads, conventional explosives. These are pinpoint accurate in their destinations. So frankly, from the moment you step over the border from Poland into Ukraine, or over the border from Romania into Ukraine, you can be targeted. And we tend to forget that just as we have space-based and terrestrial intelligence gathering assets, in other words, satellites and unmanned systems, so do the Russians. The notion that you're going to fool anybody, sneak in over the night and set up somewhere in western Ukraine with impunity is crazy. If we go into that country, we will come under fire. And frankly, if you're a Russian, you know this is quote unquote multinational. Your first instinct is to destroy the U.S. forces, who are ultimately leading it, who are the core element of the force, as well as U.S. command and control, which is effectively NATO command and control. NATO has no independent command and control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, none of it. It's all dependent upon us. So this is an invitation to direct war with Russia.
It's unbelievable because as we sit here, we're not hearing anything out of Washington about this. There's really no discussion at all about it. All we keep hearing in Pentagon briefings is these are the new advanced systems that we are sending to Ukraine, Vampire anti-drone systems. You've talked about a number of different specialty heavy weapons that you were talking about a few weeks ago. Now we're hearing that those are being ramped up to be moved into Ukraine as well. So we're not hearing anything from Washington about this. And what happens, Colonel, once the American soldiers start arriving in coffins at Dover Air Force Base?
Well, it depends on your perspective. I think the assumption is...
Just like here in Ireland, right? They sent the black and tans in here into Ireland years ago, the English did. They were the little guerrilla warfare boys they sent in undercover, and then they were killing the Irish. That's what the black and tans were doing. And that's what the Americans are doing now, sending in little undercover little fucking groups and attacking Russia. And that's what the Ukraine has been doing. We had the black and tans, and the Ukraine have Nazis fighting. The Nazis are fighting for the Ukrainians, and the black and tans here were fighting for the English. So it's the same thing, like, that's what's going on. And them scumbags at the top won't be happy till the nukes come in our fucking doors while they're in their bunkers tucked away with a food supply to last them 100 years and umpteen hundred thousands of gallons of diesel and generators and everything that they don't want you to have. Oh, keep down your carbon footprint, don't be using so much diesel, while they have umpteen thousands of gallons of it, umpteen hundreds of thousands of gallons of it stored away for their generators to run the show. So they'll be, while we're freezing to death and starving, they'll be sweltering the heat and eating like kings. Living like kings. Jacuzzis, the lot they'll have while we have freezing cold fucking water in the winter.
Is potentially in some...
Water you should never drink, fluoridated poisonous water. Even when you're in the shower, be careful because it can absorb through your skin as well.
By this administration, that if they go into Western Ukraine and our forces do come under fire and American lives are lost, that there will be, quote-unquote, a rally round the flag effect inside the United States, and everyone will clamor for war with Russia. You know, it's happened before. I mean, if we go back to Pearl Harbor, I mean, quite frankly, Pearl Harbor was something that everyone knew was inevitable as soon as the oil embargo was imposed on Japan. And the Japanese submitted 3 peace proposals, the last one in October of 1941, that met all of our demands, and we rejected all of it. So the Navy wanted to move the fleet out of Pearl Harbor, and FDR insisted that it stay there. Now, as a result, the United States, if you look at the polling data, which was overwhelmingly opposed to entrance into war in Europe, was then left with no choice, a fait accompli. But this is not Pearl Harbor. Western Ukraine is not Pearl Harbor. It is not part of the United States. It's not territory that we protect. It is not an extension of NATO. And so if we do this, I think they're making a mistake. I think a lot of people are going to be suspicious and say, well, wait a minute, what are we doing in Western Ukraine anyway? But I suspect they're betting that they might be able to get what they want, which is a direct military confrontation with Russia. We haven't even talked about the nuclear dimension.
So, and there's going to be big food shortages coming on the way, lads. And you won't be able to get a drop of diesel. All them shortages are on the way. That's the way they won't be happy until we're all in there. You see? Until you're inside in one of them, then they'll be happy. But they won't go out and do the fighting. They'll send you out to fighting, your family and brothers and sisters to die, but they won't go out doing any of the dying. So no the crack anyway. 1809? Alright, down here to the front, I bet you. Yeah. Or I can go right down here to the front is where the oldest ones will be. 1809, 200 years ago. 210 years ago, like. But that's going to be the crack, lads. That's going to be the crack. If they don't stop pushing this wall, like there'll be a lot of these getting put up, a lot of these. You want, yeah. That will be like chaff to the wind. And NATO keeps talking about nuclear weapons. They're blaming Putin talking about nuclear weapons. And Putin wasn't. He's saying you're the ones that keep talking about nuclear weapons. And if you keep talking about them the way you are, well, we better start talking about them too.
But my concern has always been that if we go into Western Ukraine and we take heavy casualties, and the Russians decide, well, that's the end of it, no more nonsense, and just roll us up. In other words, really roll right into contact with us and roll up to the border with Poland and Romania, that people in Washington will say, well, we have to use a nuclear weapon. Because if we don't, we will be seen as losing. Remember, every time that Stoltenberg has talked, he says, well, NATO cannot lose this war. If this war is lost and Ukraine does not prevail, that will be seen as a loss to NATO. Well, if you're going to take that position, then the nuclear option does loom in the background. Hopefully there are people with common sense in Washington that understand that is not an option. Because the use of any nuclear weapon, if we say, well, this is a small nuclear weapon, that's okay to use. It's only 5 kilotons,
right.
Which is maybe half the damage of Hiroshima. That's okay to use that. We're insane because the Russian will look at this and say, oh, they're using nuclear weapons? Launch a first strike. No more nonsense. And suddenly we are staring into the abyss of nuclear winter and catastrophe.
What does a confrontation with Russia look like at this moment, and whether or not NATO forces are involved or not? We hear, I'm curious your assessment now of the 300,000 and these, arguably a few weeks away, maybe a few days away from ground freezing and this mobilization unfolding. And
I think that based upon the weather that I'm hearing from Ukraine, it may be another 2, 3, 4 weeks before it freezes thoroughly. So there may be a space there, and that's what worries me about this multinational force, that they may see this as an opportunity before the Russian offensives begin.
And we're hearing reports of a lot of mercenaries now on the battlefield on the Ukrainian side. Is that indicative of the fact that the Ukrainian army is all but destroyed?
Yeah, their manpower is almost exhausted. What's interesting to me is to hear people in NATO say, well, the Ukrainians have limitless manpower, as though every human being who is a man, and potentially even women, can somehow or another be dragooned into fighting. They've already got problems with desertion. They've got problems with people that refuse to fight. They've had units up and down the line in front of Kherson and all the way up to the Russian border saying we're not going to attack anymore because to attack these Russian defenses is suicidal. And indeed, they're correct, it is. So now you turn to mercenaries. We have a lot of Polish troops in Russia or Ukrainian uniform. We have some Romanians apparently now joining this. I think the latest count on ISIS fighters hired by the United States government to fight for Ukraine is about 70, maybe 80 by now. This is something that is beyond our imagination. By the way, when people talk about the Russians, they don't understand something. Every Tsarist Russian army, and in fact the Soviet army, had large numbers of non-Slavs and non-Europeans in it, always. Large portions of historic Russian cavalry consisted of Mongolian, Tartar, Turkic troops. This is nothing new, and the Chechens have fought with the Russians as well as against them on many, many occasions. This is not new either. So it's a little different when you start talking about Ukrainians. This is a very different thing for Ukraine. Ukrainians historically have not imported anybody to fight for them, but of course they've taken serious losses.
When this mobilization happens in a few weeks, what do you anticipate will happen from the Russian side of the mobilization? I mean, I'm asking you.
The mobilization is already underway, but I mean, it's close to being over. In other words, the first 300,000 are largely showing up now in the support formations and in some of the combat formations that need to reach 100%, preferably 105 or 110% strength before you go into action. But the mobilization itself in Russia, I'm told, is not really being terminated. It quietly continues, and that's why I've told people that potentially by January, end of January, you could have as many as 1 million Russian troops in the field. Now, numbers do matter. They're not always decisive. But the other point is this business about equipment. The equipment that we're seeing show up right now is better than any of the equipment they've used to this point. In addition to that, they have inexhaustible quantities of equipment and of ammunition. I mean, pause and remember for a second, how many times did the Institute for the Study of War and all the other violently anti-Russian, pro-globalist, pro-neocon organizations tell us, oh, the Russians are running out of ammunition, the Russians are running out of missiles, the Russians can't do this much longer. It's always been wrong. Russia is prepared, and Russia can fight as long as it needs to sustain itself. Europe, on the other hand, is very different. They don't have the fuel, they don't have the power, the electricity. Just look at the diesel issue that you brought up the other day.
Right.
The diesel problem over there is acute, not in Russia, but in Ukraine and in Europe. So you start pushing forces into Western Ukraine. How long can you keep them moving? How do you ensure that they can be supplied and provided with transportation? More important, how do you replace your losses? And the Russians have taken some losses, they're all replaced. But Ukrainian losses are much higher, over 100,000 dead and perhaps 300,000-400,000 wounded. They've had a lot of trouble replacing them. And they're replacing them with reservists and what we would call National Guardsmen with very little military experience and background. But the Russians can do this, we cannot. So these are very important factors that should be considered. But in the White House, I think it's fantasy island. People are developing strategies and ideas in isolation from broader realities. Most important, once again, they're not listening to Putin. They're not listening to the Russians. You can't just go on ignoring what people tell you. They're serious. Take them seriously. And don't assume that because we're Americans and we cross into Ukraine, no one will shoot at us. That's absurd.
Because that's what they're doing now, right? American soldiers are gone in there to scope out the place to literally cause a third world war. That's what they're going to bring in, the Holocaust in the half us. So do the research, go over there to the news channel, redact it. And you'll see what's really going on. Or go to Jimmy Dorn, another good channel there that gets the truth out there. Following the 1830s cholera epidemics and the Great Famine in the 1840s, new burial grounds were needed in Limerick's Mount St. Lawrence's Cemetery. Was officially opened on the 29th of March 1849 in the cemetery, presented over by Dr. John Ryan, Bishop of Limerick. So that was the famine nurse, and there's over 70,000 people buried in this.
Since 1955.
Since records, whenever they started keeping the records, they said. When did they start keeping the records? I don't know, 1850s or something. Yeah, 1850s, something like that anyway. But all the fake media here in Ireland and throughout the world, they're pushing this war. It's like they're mad for a nuclear war. And, well, the Ukraine, 90% of their infrastructure is wiped out, so they're going to be freezing. When the winter comes, they're going to freeze to death. They're barely able to keep the place. Most of the time, Ukraine are in the darkness. Most of the cities are in the darkness now as we speak. And their people are going to freeze to death. They're getting used by Joe Biden and all his scumbags. So they're saying they care about the Ukraine, but they don't give a shit. They're using that place for a battlefield, a battleground. No man's land is what they're turning it into. And the Ukrainian people, they're being brainwashed as well by the media. There's one Ukrainian journalist, she came out there the other day and she was saying that. And she's a Ukrainian herself, she was saying that the weapons are going into the hands of the Nazis. They're going into the hands of ISIS, that's where the weapons are going. And she is a Ukrainian journalist in the Ukraine, and she's telling the truth. She's saying, no, the weapons, they're using the Ukraine as a battleground, and the weapons are going into the Nazis' hands. And Zelensky, he's going around there then saying he's on the streets, supposed to be. I'm out here on the streets of Kiev, when in fact he's behind a green screen. He's a green screen, he's not even out in the streets, alright? So you've been manipulated with green screens and everything. So just know the crack anyway, lads. Next year it's going to be bitter cold. There's going to be blackouts. There's going to be no diesel. There's going to be shortage of fuel, shortage of food. It's going to be like, it's like in the Bible when they're on about the plagues and the pestilence and the starvation. It's all going to be coming our way. It's going to be made happen. As I said, people go home with the dark side. They don't give a shit. They don't care. Right? Go home with the dark side to bring Armageddon in on top of us. Like that's what we're told according to the Bible. You'll bring Armageddon in on top of yourselves. It's ye are going to be humans are going to go out with the dark side. It's your weapons and your killing and your murdering and your starving. And it's you'll be bringing it in on top of yourselves. Not that Jesus is going to come down and bring it in on top of us, no. It's going to be all in on top of us, brought in by our own. Now they're on about disarming Israel, wanting Israel to get rid of its nuclear weapons under the EU and the guise of the EU. And we'll keep an eye on your nuclear weapons fee. Nothing about Iran. Nothing about Iran coming in to the talks and keeping their nuclear weapons, because Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon. Their plan is to blow Israel off the face of the earth. They want Israel gone. But you never hear Israel saying that about Iran. You never hear Israel calling for the death of every other country. But then people are so much brainwashed, they blame the Jews for everything. And if you're a Christian, then know this. God says, he who curses Israel, I will curse ye. Right? And he who blesses Israel, I will bless ye. So the nations, including our own nation here in Ireland, they're turning against Israel. When I was a child, we all knew the Holy Land and Israel, the Holy Land, God. Now it's no. Bring in the rainbow flags instead. That's what you do. So nothing about Iran getting its nuclear weapons right to blow everyone in Israel, the men, women and children, to dust if they get their chance. But they're on about Israel putting away its nukes. But Israel never said it has nukes. It doesn't tell them. It abstains from that. It just doesn't say what we have or what we don't have. So know the truth, lads, because it's in the wind, right? And it's coming down the pipeline. Bitterness, freezing cold, pestilence, plagues, starvation, wars, rumours of wars and more wars, and death in its fucking hundreds of thousands. That's all coming this way fast. So with that said, God bless you and your family, and boom.
Checking out the plot, lads, know what I mean? Buying a new gaff.
Oh, I was buying the plot. Look at that steel one there, so we can steel one.
Where's she?
Behind that little thing there, behind that there. Yeah, behind the crypt, look, little steel one.
What's that lumina here?
Yeah.
Buying a little plot, lads. Which one do you think? I'm going to look.
Go over here.
What's the smile on my face, as you can see?
Go up and have a
Finally got, lads. Finally got the new gaff off the door. I finally got the new gaff, lads. The council came through. Fair play. They told me one of the days we'll get to a lovely plot. They told me pick out any of these and get in there soon.